At 40 years old, Nate Diaz has finally told the story he's kept buried for over a decade. For years, fans thought they knew everything about the Stockton brawler, the bloody wars, the middle finger taunts, the unforgettable moments that made him a cult hero. But now, Nate says one fight from his career hides a truth he's never spoken about until now. A story involving betrayal, danger, and a behind-the-scenes twist that could change how fans see him forever. And the most shocking part? It's a fight you thought you already knew. Before Nate Diaz was one of MMA's most recognizable names, he was just another kid navigating the gritty streets of Stockton, California. This was a place where respect wasn't given. It was taken. Nate and his older brother Nick grew up in a working-class home, their single mother doing her best to keep the family afloat while they dealt with the pressures of a rough neighborhood. Fistfights weren't rare. They were a rite of passage. Nate learned quickly that in Stockton, you had to be ready to stand up for yourself at all times, because the moment you showed weakness, someone would exploit it. His first introduction to martial arts came through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at Cesar Gracie's academy. Nate was young, small for his age, and constantly pushed around in the gym, but that constant struggle forged his competitive mindset. He adopted the Stockton attitude, a mix of stubborn pride and unshakable toughness. He wasn't just learning how to fight physically, he was learning how to fight mentally. If someone said he couldn't do something, he'd find a way to prove them wrong. Nate's early amateur fights were scrappy and unpolished, but his relentless pace and fearlessness stood out. Even back then, there was a fire in him that couldn't be coached. He didn't fight for sport alone. He fought to assert his place in the world. It wasn't about being flashy or looking good in front of a crowd. It was about imposing his will, no matter the cost. Those who trained with Nate in those days say he always had an edge to him. If someone in the gym talked down to him, he'd settle it on the mats. If a sparring partner came in with an ego, Nate would break them down over endless rounds until they quit. And while his older brother Nick had already started to make waves in the MMA scene, Nate was quietly building his own reputation. But even in these early days, there was a hint of something Nate didn't talk about. A certain incident, a certain type of fight that stuck with him in a way the others didn't. He never named it, never gave detail, but those closest to him knew whatever happened, it left a mark. By 2007, Nate Diaz's talent and toughness had earned him a spot on The Ultimate Fighter Season 5, a platform that would introduce him to a national audience. The show's environment was chaotic, cameras rolling constantly, tempers flaring between fighters, and Dana White keeping a close watch on who could deliver both inside the cage and in front of the lens. Nate fit in immediately, or rather, he didn't fit in, and that's what made him stand out. He wasn't there to be a TV personality, he was there to fight. But that raw authenticity became his brand. Throughout the season, Nate showed the same grit he'd developed in Stockton. He absorbed punishment without breaking, used slick submissions to end fights, and brought a quiet confidence to every matchup. When he won the finale against Manny Gamburian via a freak shoulder injury after Nate had worked him into a tight submission, it wasn't just a victory. It was the moment Nate stepped out from Nick's shadow and into his own spotlight. But while the cameras caught his wins, they didn't catch the way Nate was already learning to navigate the business side of fighting. He noticed how certain fighters got favorable treatment. He saw how some matchups seemed designed to build certain careers, while others were quietly set up to fail. He started understanding that fighting wasn't always just about the better man winning. Sometimes there were other forces at play. Even then, Nate was selective about what he shared publicly. He gave interviews in his own unpolished style, speaking in a way that felt unfiltered, but often left more unsaid than said. Behind that blunt exterior, there was strategy, a decision to keep certain stories to himself. And one of those stories was connected to a fight he'd go on to have later in his career, a fight that would linger in his mind long after the final bell. As Nate's UFC career progressed, he began to solidify the image fan he wasn't. He didn't put on a fake smile for the cameras or bite his tongue when he disagreed with the promotion. He stood next to his brother Nick at press conferences, the two of them often speaking out about fighter pay, unfair treatment, and matchups they believed were designed to keep them down. This anti-establishment energy made Nate a cult hero. Hardcore fans saw him as one of the last real fighters in the sport, someone who wasn't chasing approval or bending the knee to corporate interests. But that authenticity came with a cost. It meant that when Nate had a bad night, the UFC wasn't in a rush to give him favorable opportunities. It meant when Nate demanded better pay, he had to sit out for long stretches, waiting for a fight that made sense. And yet, through all the ups and downs, Nate kept certain details of his career buried. There was one fight, and one night in particular, that didn't fit neatly into his public narrative. It wasn't about a loss or a win. It wasn't even about the opponent. It was about something that happened behind the scenes, something that made him see the sport in a completely different light. And for years, he refused to talk about it. But as Nate turned 40, he decided the time had finally come. By 2016, Nate Diaz was already respected among hardcore MMA fans, but he wasn't a mainstream name. That all changed in March of that year when the UFC called him on short notice to fight Conor McGregor. Then the sport's biggest star, at UFC 196, was preparing for Rafael dos Anjos. But when dos Anjos pulled out, Nate stepped in with just 11 days to prepare. Most fighters would have said no. Nate didn't hesitate. What followed became one of the most iconic moments in MMA history. After weathering McGregor's early storm, Nate's legendary cardio and durability began to take over. In the second round, he landed a clean 1-2 that rocked McGregor, followed by a flurry that forced the Irishman to shoot for a desperate takedown. That was a mistake. Within seconds, Nate had taken his back and locked in a rear naked choke. The tap heard around the world came moments later. The crowd exploded. Joe Rogan's call echoed through the arena, and Nate's post-fight interview cemented his place in UFC lore. "I'm not surprised, mother effers." Overnight, Nate went from cult hero to global headline. The UFC saw dollar signs and booked an immediate rematch at UFC 202. This time, the fight went the distance, with McGregor earning a razor-close majority decision. The rivalry became one of the sport's biggest draws, and Nate's profile skyrocketed. But fame came with its own set of problems. Nate was suddenly a high-value asset for the UFC, yet he still clashed with the promotion over pay and matchmaking. He refused to take fights that didn't make sense for him, even if it meant sitting out for years at a time. Still, the McGregor fights guaranteed him a permanent place in MMA history. But as Nate's career moved forward, he carried with him a private memory. A fight that, in his mind, wasn't just about the opponent. A fight where, behind the scenes, the forces at play felt different. That story wasn't ready to be told in 2016. It wasn't ready to be told when he fought Jorge Masvidal in 2019 either. But the seeds of that untold story were already planted, and they would haunt Nate in ways fans could never see. Every fighter has bouts they'd rather forget, the ones where preparation was off, where injuries lingered, where something about the night just didn't feel right. For Nate Diaz, there was one fight in particular that gnawed at him long after the crowd went home. In interviews, he'd sometimes hint that there were things about that night he didn't want to talk about, but he'd never go into detail. From the start, the fight in question felt different. The weigh-in had a strange energy, not just the usual trash talk and stare down, but a subtle tension between Nate and certain UFC officials. The opponent seemed unusually aggressive, even backstage, pacing and muttering under his breath. Nate brushed it off as fight hype, but looking back, he says the tone was set before they even stepped into the cage. Training camp for that fight had been rocky. Sparring partners dropped out unexpectedly. There were changes to his corner lineup that weren't his idea. And for reasons no one explained, the bout order was shuffled on fight night, forcing Nate into a longer wait in the back. He later admitted this extra downtime put him in an odd headspace. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. When asked years later, Nate said he could feel a shadow over the event. He didn't mean that literally, but it was his way of describing the sense that there were more players involved than just him, his opponent, and the referee. Whether it was matchmakers, sponsors, or something else entirely, he wouldn't say. Not yet. All fans saw was a hard fight that went the distance. But what they didn't see, what Nate never told them, was the confrontation that happened minutes before his walkout, one that changed how he viewed the fight entirely. That part of the story would stay locked away for over a decade. The day of the fight began like any other for Nate Diaz. Morning shakeout, light meal, mental focus on the job ahead. But as soon as he arrived at the venue, he noticed subtle differences. Security was tighter than usual, not just around the arena, but in the locker room area. Certain hallways were blocked off. Staff he'd worked with in the past seemed unusually guarded in their conversations. Nate tried to ignore it, but the feeling kept growing. While getting his hands wrapped, a member of the UFC staff came into his locker room and spoke quietly to one of his corner men. Nate asked what it was about. His corner told him it was nothing, but his gut told him otherwise. Then, during warm-ups, another official came in to remind him, almost insistently, about the fight's time schedule and the importance of sticking to it. Just before the walkout, the tension peaked. Nate claims an unnamed individual, someone with enough influence to be backstage, approached him with a cryptic statement. "Let's make this a good show tonight." It wasn't the words alone, but the tone that made Nate pause. He interpreted it as a warning, or perhaps as pressure to let the fight go a certain way. He didn't respond. He simply walked to the cage, but in his mind, the night had shifted. He was no longer just fighting an opponent. He was fighting the unease in his own head. He'd go on to perform, to battle, to put on a fight the fans enjoyed. But internally, he was processing every odd detail, every strange interaction, wondering if there was more going on than anyone was willing to admit. For years, Nate said nothing. Fans saw only another Diaz war, and analysts debated the technical side of it. But behind Nate's stone-faced demeanor that night was a man who believed something about that fight wasn't pure, and it would take until his 40th birthday for him to finally break his silence. When the cage door closed that night, Nate Diaz knew something was off. The first few exchanges confirmed his suspicion. His opponent was sharper than usual, unusually aggressive in the opening seconds, almost as if he'd been told to make an immediate statement. Nate had fought aggressive opponents before, but this felt different. Every time Nate tried to settle into his rhythm, the referee intervened, warning him for borderline actions he'd gotten away with in countless other fights. The first round was fast-paced. Nate absorbed early shots, but as always, he stayed composed. He started landing his jab, throwing in the Stockton slap to disrupt his opponent's timing, but the energy in the building felt strange, muted in some moments, overly reactive in others. Between rounds, Nate's corner gave him advice, but their tone felt different too, cautious, almost as if they didn't want to push him too hard. In the second round, the odd officiating continued. Every clinch seemed to be broken faster than normal. Every attempt Nate made to work his jiu-jitsu game was interrupted. When he finally got his opponent to the mat, the stand-up came quickly, almost as if there was no interest in letting the fight play out on the ground. Nate noticed his opponent smirking between exchanges, not the kind of smirk fighters give in the heat of battle, but something more knowing. By the final round, Nate was frustrated. He pushed the pace, landed clean combinations, and forced his opponent into brawling exchanges. The crowd roared as they traded punches, but Nate's mind wasn't just on the fight. It was on all the moments that had led up to this. The odd interactions backstage, the subtle warnings, the unusual behavior from officials. It was enough to make him wonder if the fight's outcome had been shaped before the first punch was thrown. When the final horn sounded, Nate didn't raise his hands or play to the crowd. He walked back to his corner with a flat expression, as if the result didn't matter. The decision was read, the crowd reacted, and the fight went down in the record books like any other. But for Nate, it was a night that stayed with him, not because of the scorecards, but because of the unanswered questions that still haunted him years later. At 40 years old, Nate Diaz finally decided to talk. Sitting in a dimly lit interview, he leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but edged with the same defiance he'd carried his entire career. "I didn't say nothing about it back then," he began, "because I knew if I did, I'd be done." What followed was a story that MMA fans had never heard. Nate revealed that hours before the fight, he was approached by someone connected to the event. Not a random staff member, but someone with enough influence to shape the night's outcome. They told him, in vague but loaded terms, that the fight needed to go the distance and keep it competitive. At first, Nate brushed it off as generic fight talk, but then the same message came again from a different person, this time with a tone that felt more like an instruction than a suggestion. According to Nate, he believed his opponent had already agreed to certain conditions. He wouldn't say outright that it was fixed, but he hinted that the fight was being used to set up bigger promotional plans, and his role was to make it look good without derailing those plans. "They thought I'd just play along," Nate said, "but I'm not here to be part of somebody's script." He admitted he went into the fight angry, feeling like the deck was stacked against him. He fought hard anyway, refusing to let anyone dictate the way he competed, but he also knew the officiating and fight environment weren't in his favor. "They didn't want me to win that night," he said bluntly. "They wanted me to show up, put on a show, and go home." For years, Nate kept the story to himself to protect his career and avoid burning bridges. But now, no longer tied to the UFC and with nothing left to lose, he decided the truth mattered more than the consequences. "People think all fights are fair," he said. "I'm telling you right now, sometimes they ain't." As the interview drew to a close, Nate Diaz didn't look bitter. If anything, he looked at peace. "I've been through a lot of fights, a lot of bulls, and I'm still here," he said. "That night didn't break me. It just showed me what I was dealing with." He spoke about how the experience changed the way he approached his career, how it fueled his desire to fight for himself, not just for a promotion's bottom line. He reflected on the toll the sport had taken, the scar tissue, the years of training camp wars, the mental grind of negotiations and disputes. But he also acknowledged the loyalty of his fans, who stuck with him through long layoffs and controversial fights. "The real ones know what I'm about," he said. "They know I'm not here to fake it for a paycheck." Then came his message to the next generation of fighters. "Don't let anybody own you," Nate warned. "Don't let them tell you how to fight, who to fight, or when to fight. If you give them that, you ain't a fighter no more. You're an actor." His tone was firm, almost protective, as if speaking directly to the young fighters just starting out in the sport. Nate admitted that the fight he spoke about would always be part of his story, but it wouldn't define him. What defined him, in his eyes, was every time he stepped into the cage and fought on his own terms, even when the system wanted otherwise. "I fought my fight," he said, "every damn time, even when they didn't want me to." With that, the interview ended. No dramatic music, no flashy closing montage, just Nate Diaz walking away the same way he always had. Unapologetic, unfiltered, and now, finally, unafraid to tell the story he'd been hiding for years.